Hello, everyone. My name's Theresa here from Vectr Solutions, and I'm here today with my colleague, Kenny Wright. Kenny, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Doing great. I'm thinking this topic might get me into a little bit of trouble, but I'm willing to keep going with it.
That means that we picked the right topic. So today we're going to be talking about something Kenny and I hear frequently when we're working with companies moving to GovCloud. They always want to know, can't we just lift and shift what we already have? Sounds simple. Let's just take the existing Salesforce environment and move it into GovCloud, and we can just continue operating the same way. So, why that looks like it's the fastest and least expensive option, it actually can create much larger technical, financial, and organizational problems later. So, our goal today is to unpack that from a couple different angles. I'll talk about the business process and change management considerations, and Kenny will walk us through the technical realities of moving from a commercial Salesforce environment into GovCloud. So, Kenny, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the migration itself, let's remind everyone why we approach these moves the way that we do here at Vectr.
Sure. Our position is that sustainable transformation requires the people, process, and the technology to all move in sync. You need to understand the people who are affected, the process they follow day to day, and the technology supporting that process. And you need a way to measure whether the change actually works. A lot of transformations begin and end with the tech, but because the tech is really the most visible thing that you're purchasing, that you're spending a ton of money on, and that feels like what you're actually moving. But if the people don't trust it or the process underneath it is broken inherently, the technology doesn't really create meaningful change. And that's really very true with what a lift and shift is, because the instinct is to preserve what you had before and preserve all of that when you do migrate. But preserving the technology may also preserve the friction and all the issues that come along with it.
Makes sense. So let's get into that a little bit more today. So this is not an argument against GovCloud or GovCloud migrations. Obviously, GovCloud can provide incredible foundation for organizations that are handling sensitive information or data while also making sure that they have the appropriate security and authorization controls in place. The question really is about whether you use the move as an opportunity to improve your organizational efficiencies or to simply transport all of the existing problems into a more controlled environment. So let's get into that and help you understand how to make this decision. So usually when we're working with these organizations or companies, there's some kind of pressure. A customer introduces a new security expectation. You're working with the federal government and you're trying to figure out how quickly do you move. So now that you are getting into this new type of work, leadership wants to reduce risk, and a contract or procurement opportunity might require these capabilities in GovCloud. Those are great and legitimate reasons to evaluate GovCloud, but the problem begins when leadership asks for the fastest path rather than the right path. So lift and shift always looks more attractive because the initial plan appears straightforward. We already have a system. We already paid to build it. Let's just move it instead of reconsidering everything. So, Kenny, from a technical lens, what do people usually assume when they hear lift and shift?
So the assumption is that GovCloud is the same thing as like a Salesforce commercial cloud environment. It's just got stronger security in it. And from that perspective, moving sounds a lot like you're just copy pasting the current configuration into a different location, right? And that's what a lot of people seem to think. But GovCloud is actually its own separate environment entirely. It has different endpoints, different infrastructure behind the scenes, all based on AWS GovCloud. And those things that connect to it also adhere to that same boundary. So your existing Salesforce commercial environment or just your existing environment may have been built over many years. It could have incurred its own level of integrations with third-party applications, custom code that's been added by rogue developers. You've built all the automations on top of it, and you've just poured data into the system. So all of those decisions were made on that commercial environment over that time. And when you move to GovCloud, those assumptions that you made before may not be as relevant and should be re-examined when going to GovCloud.
So, even if the functionality, the UI looks familiar, what's happening behind the scenes actually is very different.
That's exactly right. A user may see a button that performs a really simple action, but behind that button, the custom code or API call or whatever that's being done, that data exchange is happening potentially with a different system or done in a different way to be more secure. And so that's why kind of the discovery phase is super important. Organizations often believe they know what's in their environment until we begin like asking very detailed questions about it, like how many integrations there are, which third-party apps have you installed, which scheduled jobs are running, a whole host of different things. So the answers are usually more complicated than expected because when folks start looking under the hood, they start remembering the thing they did 10 years ago, right? And then they don't remember why they had it. And in some cases, they don't even use it anymore.
And that gets at more than just the technology. That's where process becomes more important and understanding underneath all of the technology what the process looks like. So, where technology is not operating independently, we know it's supporting a process. And sometimes that process is informal, poorly documented, or people just don't remember. So, one of the biggest mistakes I think we see companies making is assuming that the system itself represents the process, but a lot of times it doesn't. So the system may show the process leadership believes employees are following, but many times employers are actually doing something completely different because they've also created workarounds over time. So the whole lift and shift mentality in looking at the technology without studying the actual process risks moving a documented version of the organization while leaving the real work somewhere else. And that creates an immediate disconnect. So let's talk a little bit more about Kenny's favorite metaphor, the moving of the house metaphor. So he loves to talk about this. He loves to talk about you can take time before you move to actually decide what you still use, what needs to be repaired, how much stuff should you bring into the new house, and what should you throw away. A lot of times he's talking about this in terms of do you really need to take the broken chair or the boxes you haven't opened or the junk drawer? So technically, the move could be finished, but you brought all of the clutter with it. So, Kenny, do you want to share some more thoughts on how to pack lightly?
Yeah, so that junk drawer you bring over that you use all the time, it's now a highly secure junk drawer, but it's not, but you should have cleaned it up, right? That's the whole point. So it's probably more expensive too because now you're using infrastructure that is inherently more secure and more expensive as a result. Why not come in and clean it up at the time of move, which is the whole point of the house example, of course. But yeah, that's the biggest takeaway is finding the things that you have always had excuses to not do. Now is the time to do it. And that junk drawer is always, and I have a really nasty junk drawer myself. So having to clean that out is a great metaphor. I'll add that to my list.
And I think the other piece here is that it ends up being the more expensive one as well, meaning there's an illusion that this financially is better or more cost effective. But once you start bringing the junk drawers and the unopened boxes, it's not. So when leadership is comparing options, lift and shift may appear to be less expensive because they think the initial scope is smaller, but you're really not spending the time to redesign process, clean data, doing all of the cleaning that you would do before you move your house. So that initial estimate doesn't capture the cost of doing a lot of that after you've gone live. How much will it cost to rebuild integrations? How much time do employees lose now with the workarounds they have in place? And what will remediation look like once it's already operating in the new environment? So on the surface level, this decision looks inexpensive, but what we found is that during the migration phase, we find this cost of having to unpack or go through the junk drawer and figuring out what actually was never working to standard in the commercial environment. So that doesn't appear as a line item in terms of costs. And that time that employees are spending trying to find this information or work these different processes, that's also amounts to a loss of trust, especially when leadership is announcing a new platform, moving to a new market, and now they're still using the same junk drawer that they had in the last house. So let's talk a little bit more about this, Kenny, in terms of the real costs. We know that they affect performance, adoption, morale, and the ability for companies to introduce future changes. Can you say a little bit more about this?
Yeah, the code, the integrations, all of that can be fixed and rebuilt and as needed over time. But getting the trust of your user base is way harder and much more fragile. And that once these users have seen these failures, they just will always assume the worst, that the system is wrong, even after it's been fixed, right? They run that report, double check the spreadsheets, but they still have to check in with someone else in email and make sure that it's correct. So again, the organization hasn't replaced the old process, it's just added another layer to it. So again, that trust is definitely way more important, especially with the world that we're living in now, where a lot of that code and integration stuff is not as daunting to actually change as it used to be with the advent of AI or Gen AI.
So then let's talk about the people side of all of this. So one of the patterns that I know that we see frequently, especially with our customers, is that they treat the technical migration as the project and change management as something that happens near the end. So we know that leadership makes the decision to move to GovCloud, the technical team does their thing, and then shortly before go live, employees get enabled and onboarded to the system. But we know that's not enough because people begin experiencing change long before they enter a training session. So if they hear that their company is moving to a new environment but don't understand why, they start filling in the missing information themselves. Does this mean my role changes? Will my work be more difficult? Is leadership trying to monitor us more closely? What sort of capabilities are we going to lose in our new system? So, whether leadership answers those questions openly or not, employees are typically already thinking about these things, and making sure that they're invited into the discussion early, I think is important. And what I think we see is that sometimes lift and shift sounds like a IT project. And so the business isn't even brought in till the end, until we get to training. But we know that training, if we're thinking about our ADKAR model and ProSci framework, that only addresses the end, the knowledge and ability. So if you haven't gone back and done the due diligence about creating awareness, getting buy-in, you're already losing out on adoption as soon as you start the project. So I think a lot of times companies want to move right into the knowledge. Here's a new system. Let's show you how it works. Here's the instructions. But what we find sometimes is that employees come into this not really understanding, in some cases, how this even applies to the federal government operations. And then what we find is that spirals into other problems that ultimately create issues with adoption. So, if you skip those steps in terms of building awareness, desire, and generally just alignment with the business, what ends up happening is training becomes an exercise in stakeholders telling us how to use something they've already decided they don't trust, or they start telling us their workarounds. Thoughts on that, Kenny?
Yeah, and to add to that, that also affects the technical design. The people who perform the work every day understand the exceptions, informal handoffs, the edge cases that may not appear in the process documentation. And if they're not involved early, we may build a technically correct solution, but it's based off of an incomplete understanding of the work, which is basically still wrong, even though it's correct, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think our best practice here, we like to follow the ProSci model. And one of the pieces of the ProSci model in terms of building awareness, desire, is really leveraging champion networks. And champion networks really are stakeholders from across the company that are involved with the processes that we're migrating. And we try to make sure that we understand their current state and how they're currently operating. And then we want to make sure that they're involved as part of the implementation. Whether you choose to go with a lift and shift or build from scratch, we want them to be able to join demos, give feedback, make sure that they're identifying other maybe offline processes that aren't reflected in terms of the initial commercial design, so that when we get to go live, we see that employees or stakeholders are already built in and bought into the process, and that they're not only hearing from us as consultants, but they're also hearing from their team in terms of leadership on how the process and technology are going to work. So these champions, that's really their role, is to help build that organic trust and understanding of where the system is going, and that inherently builds adoption. So instead of the story being leadership made this decision and now we have to deal with it, it becomes people who understand our work helped shape this. And that shift can significantly change how the transformation is received and ultimately the adoption and investment that you've made in GovCloud. So let's talk a little bit more about process. So we know that a lot of these companies come into a Salesforce project, especially with GovCloud, thinking about capabilities, security. They want to make sure they have a portal, they want dashboards, they want workflows, integrations. But one of the first questions that we ask is how the work happens today. And the reason that's important is because we need to understand current state to know Where does the process begin? Who makes the decisions? What steps exist because they're required versus how they actually operate. So, Kenny, anything that you want to mention in terms of friction that you see in terms of how process shows up on the technical side?
Yeah, if an employee constantly has to stop and figure out where information lives or who owns the next step or which version of a document is actually the right version, it becomes very difficult to sustain the focus. Those interruptions, they stack up. People, they're busy all day, they're responding to messages, updating systems, checking spreadsheets, following up with their colleagues and friends, but they're spending so much of their energy managing that process that they have very little left for the meaningful work that the process is actually supposed to be supporting. So when you automate or migrate a broken process, you may make that broken process move faster, but you haven't necessarily made it better.
Makes sense. And that might be a perfect summary of a bad kind of lift and shift. So, Kenny, let's talk specifically about the technology assessment. That's something that we typically like to do at the beginning of any sort of government cloud migrations. What should an organization inventory before they decide what moves?
So they should inventory what are the big processes that they do, and then take a step lower for each one of those big processes and say, what are the tools that we rely on to get the job done? Those tools we almost want to look at and just make sure that they're, of course, doing their best job or the optimal. They're basically addressing the pain points that we need, because it's very possible that those tools aren't necessarily even compatible with government cloud or compatible with the target organization we're migrating them to. So that's where we want to take a look at the actual capabilities that that tool provides, because the capabilities itself could reveal that they barely use the application, or they use one part of the application that's like can be used elsewhere on an application that's free or that's already native to the Salesforce platform, for example. So that's the big one, processes, and then the tools that support those processes underneath. And then from there, what are the main data points that they need to track to get their job done? And a lot of this could be reduced down to an individual employee's day. To get through their day, what are the data points that they need, right? Because a lot of the data points that they need could just boil down to 1 to 10% of the actual data they're storing. And if you add that all up across all of your employees that you're working with, it could be that half the data isn't even being used, right? Or that all those processes are no longer relevant or considered legacy. So that's how the data points kind of factor into the inventory as well. And then lastly, knowing about how the inputs come in and flow into the system in the first place. That kind of relates to the first point I made around the integrations, but the inventory of where my work starts, if that makes sense. So, what are the inputs to my work? Because a lot of that, obviously, the processes wouldn't be able to kick off at all if I don't get my inputs. So, those are extremely important and critical to inventory. I would say those are the big three, or maybe four. I don't remember how many I said there.
So then let's talk a little bit more about the data, since it sounds like the data could be the largest version of the junk drawer. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's definitely probably the largest version. Most mature Salesforce environments contain a lot of dupes, incomplete records, or non-hygienic records, basically data that's just either outdated or has been updated enough wrongly to where it's not useful and you don't trust it anymore. Unused fields, abandoned objects that have just were created as a POC and never revisited. And then, yeah, just I think the big one, of course, is just data that folks don't look at because they don't trust it anymore. That counts as bad data too, even though it may look pristine from the front. So a pure lift and shift kind of says to move everything, right? It's saying, hey, I don't care what it is. Let's just move it over, because we all know it's way more work to look through things, right? And take the time to actually find the right data. But storage, we have to remember storage has a cost. Storing all of that stuff and all that crap is costly. And then also, for every row of data that you have, there's a cost of governance. So actually having the data be there in the first place is costing, if that makes sense, not necessarily financially, but it's data you have to protect and maintain. So before migration, the organization should determine what needs to remain active, what should be archived, because we need to be thinking about it that way. If we have data that we don't use on a day-to-day basis, but maybe once a year, Does that data need to be readily available? Does it need to be retained still, though, which means that's a good use case for archiving. So I think all of those variables are up in the air when it comes to data.
Got it. And speaking of data, I think this is where when we're going into these conversations with companies, we want to make sure that we're thinking about what the actual end goal and outcomes are that we're looking for, because it's not just about what does the dashboard look like after your system launch, but what does really success look like? And if we can't get that from companies and understanding what outcomes they want to improve, it really will default to measuring whether the migration was completed or not. But if we know that the migration itself is just an activity, it's not an outcome. So having tangible outcomes that you're looking at, like processing time, having employees spend less time, or even your P-win and how you're able to capture more P-win, those are outcomes and measures of success that you'll want to think about at the beginning of your migration because that'll tell you whether the transformation actually created value versus ended up being an activity on the technical side.
And that is the exact same rule we use on the technical side as well. If we can't connect a feature, integration, application, or custom component to an outcome, we have to stop because like why would we what's the point, right? We need to be asking the questions as to why. That's critical to the building because otherwise we're just building stuff for no reason at that point if it's not towards a goal or an outcome. That doesn't necessarily mean we're removing it, but we should be asking that question because it's possible that it already exists or maybe the reason isn't good enough to keep going. Yeah, so that's exactly the same rule we apply to the tech as we develop, and we should be, as a best practice, reevaluating the why behind the tech itself.
So let's make this practical and give some good advice going into the end of the segment. So we know that a company or organization, they need to evaluate GovCloud. They may have new expectations or federal security requirements or some other business reason for pursuing work that requires the government cloud environment. What should they do before selecting a migration approach?
Definitely start with the discovery and the inventory. You do need to know what's in the environment, how each component works, and of course, what the dependencies are for those components. And then once you've got that, a level of taxonomy or categorization should be applied to those components. And some of those components may move with no changes or even limited changes, which some of that could be lifted and shifted, but not all of it, right? Some of it may need to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. Some may not even allow for a feasible rebuild because it's just so daunting and so large that we may have to choose an alternative application or a new integration approach. And so some may just be left behind entirely, not worth bringing forward at all for various reasons. So you want to make those decisions definitely before go live. The earlier is the better, just because to use the example of the house, you kind of need to know what's in your house and the stuff that and how you use the stuff in your house before you decide to move, right? Because you need to know whether or not you're taking it with you or if you need it or not.
From a change management perspective, I think I would recommend beginning with alignment and impact. So leadership needs to understand and agree on why they're making this move and what success looks like. I know a lot of times we're talking to our customers and they're like, well, we just have this one government customer, so we want to keep it simple. Great. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean that you are set up to be able to support any sort of cases that come in? Does it mean that you want to increase your sales in that way? Does it mean you're winning these contracts? There's got to be another layer to that. And then I would recommend that you, as a company, make sure you understand some of the stakeholder analysis, who's affected, how does their work change, where might you see resistance, and making sure you're identifying employees that should be involved so that they can become part of the champion network and you're not just treating this like an IT project. Because if you put all of that together and you think about readiness and adoption, that's truly what readiness and adoption looks like. It looks like people being part of the process, not just a migration of functionality or data to be able to go live. And I think making sure that you have the understanding of the environment and capabilities needs coupled with the people and process alongside it, then the risks and the outcomes are going to be much easier to accomplish because you're doing it based on informed decision making. So we covered a lot. So let's just close with a takeaway from each of us. Kenny, anything on the technical side?
Yeah, so don't move something because it's just there, right? If you don't know what it is, you got to find out what it is. So don't just move it. Don't just stop there. Find out what it is. And if you find out and nobody knows what it is, sounds like it's not that important, right? And so you should leave it behind. And that's the important thing. The rest that you find out, you know it's being used for something, inventory it, understand what it does, identify its dependencies, and connect it to that outcome, right? That's important. So if it still supports the mission, determine the right way to bring it forward. If it doesn't, the migration may be an opportunity to say bye-bye to those things, which is an awesome time to do that house cleaning. So leave the junk in the old house. If you can't figure out who's using it, leave it. It's junk. It's not being used.
I
That's my
knew that was
takeaway.
coming back. I was waiting for the metaphor.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kenny. My takeaway is to make sure you're not confusing migration as being the lowest cost without really considering the lowest cost of ownership or the total cost of ownership, because taking time to assess the technology, clean the house, look at the processes, involve people along the way, that sort of investment can definitely prevent a much larger cost later down the line when it comes to remediation, both in terms of technical and adoption remediation. So, as your company is evaluating a move into GovCloud or has already moved and is experiencing some of these challenges, that's where Vectr Solutions really can support making sure that you're doing the proper technical and change management assessment to get ready so that when you do bring government cloud online and you've set up the architecture and the functionality, that you have what you need to really be ready for adoption and getting a return on your investment. So, Kenny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And if you'd like to learn more about Vectr Solutions, you can visit our website, vectrsolutions.com, to connect with our team. And this is the first episode in a series that we're creating, so we'll be back for more. Thanks, Kenny.